in the form of panel discussion during which each speaker will speak for 15 minutes. If anyone is having trouble in hearing or viewing the webinar or is having any form of connectivity issues, please do mention in this chat and we shall try our best to address the issues from our end. Kindly note that by default, mics of all the attendees will be on mute and only panelists will be allowed to use the mic and video. If anyone from the audience would like to ask a question, they are requested to kindly use the Q&A option or to type out their questions. Please do include your name as well as your organizational affiliation along with your questions. The questions will be then presented to our panel by panelists by the moderator during these question and answer sessions accordingly. While we fully encourage you to participate, we request you to please be brief in your questions. We shall try our best to ensure that all the questions get answered within our allotted time. Please further note that all the opinions voiced at the SVI platform are independent opinions of the speakers and audiences and not the official policy of the SVI. This is an open house activity which will be live streamed on the social media. The session is being live streamed on our Facebook and our official website as well. The full recording of the webinar will be available on the official website and YouTube channel of the SVI. If anyone would like to tag or post screen caps of the events on their personal blogs, web pages, or social media, please do not forget to mention that webinar was organized by the SVI. Today, SVI has organized this international talk in order to assess the role of nuclear deterrence and the strategy in the post-Cold War era, and to reevaluate the deterrence dynamics in South Asia. We are very delighted to have a very distinguished panel for today's discussion. Now, let me introduce to our speakers. Our keynote speaker for today's webinar would be Mr. William Alberg. Mr. William Alberg is Director of Strategy Technology Arms Control Program at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Berlin, focusing on nuclear deterrence, non-proliferation, arms control, risk reduction, and other international security issues. He has previously served at NATO as the Director of Arms Control, Disarmament, and Non-Proliferation Center and worked for the US government for more than 2 decades on nuclear security and safeguards, WMD non-proliferation, arms control, and nuclear accident response. He's an experienced researcher, writer, and public speaker, having addressed the UN, European Union, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, NATO, news media, national parliaments, and published on the history of arms control. Today, he will be sharing his thoughts on the evolution of nuclear deterrence and strategy, especially in the post-Cold War era. Our second guest speaker for today's webinar will be Brigadier Retired Dr. Naeem Salek. Dr. Naeem Salek is currently a senior fellow at the Center for National Studies in Islamabad. He has taught at Qaid-e-Azam University, National Defense University, and Air University, Islamabad. He has been visiting scholar at School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C., besides being a visiting fellow at the Stanford University and Simpson Center. He has previously served as Director for Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs at the Strategic Plans Division. He holds a PhD from the University of Western Australia as well. His areas of expertise include South Asian security with special reference to Indian and Pakistani policies on nuclear and missile issues, nuclear and conventional confidence building measures, nuclear safety, security, and export controls. His book, Genesis of South Asian Nuclear Deterrence, was published by Oxford University Press in 2009. His second book, Learning to Live with the Bomb, Pakistan, 1998 till 2016, was also published by Oxford University in 2017. He has also published Nuclear Pakistan Seeking Security and Stability with the University of Press in 2018, and India's Habituation with the Bomb, 1998 till 2018, with Oxford University Press in 2019. He also published several monographs, book chapters, and research articles in the international and national publications. Today, he will be speaking on nuclearization, development, and deterrence in South Asia, South Asian perspective. Thank you, and I would like to invite Dr. Zafar Iqbal Chima to give his welcome and introductory remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Banu, for a nice introduction to the distinguished panelists. I am personally privileged to welcome Mr. William Alberg and Dr. Brigadier Naeem Salek to the discussion. The main purpose of today's discussion is to understand the changes which has taken place in the dynamics of deterrence from Cold War to the post-Cold War. We do understand how it evolved in the Cold War, but how it has changed into the post-Cold War. This is what we like to certainly learn from the experts, both Mr. William Alberg as well as Brigadier Dr. Naeem Salek. that how have these changes taken place and what is the current architecture of the nuclear deterrence, particularly at the global level, and then what is it is on the South Asian, what is the South Asian manifestation. Mr. William Alberg would provide us a background to the global level nuclear deterrence during the Cold War and the changes, how it has affected, how changes have been taken place in the post-Cold War deterrence. And Brigadier Dr. Salek would then discuss on his manifestations in South Asia. The way I understand the pillars of the post-Cold War nuclear deterrence are no more there. Gradually, they have been removed, some of them removed. For example, the ABM Treaty. The ABM Treaty has been cancelled, and the INF Treaty has also been cancelled. There are introduction of new subjects in their place, not exactly in their place, but as an additional subject to the architecture of deterrence at the global level. One is the ballistic missile defense, and the other is the preemption. There's a lot of talk of preemption at the global level as well as at the regional levels by the concerned countries that they can carry out preemption against their adversaries at this level. Particularly, we are facing this problem for India, that India is carrying out the threats of preemption against Pakistan's nuclear assets and nuclear weapons capabilities. We had understanding that preemption is an extremely impossible task. Even if the adversaries 25% or 10% capabilities are left behind, and it can be retaliated with accuracy against the aggressor, then the aggressor would possibly have it. So we thought preemption is not an ordinary talk that you can have in the realm of nuclear deterrence and strategy. But the way we are facing with it, it looks perhaps as it has become a very ordinary subject of nuclear deterrence in South Asia. So I would like to request Professor William Alberg and then Brigadier Dr. Salek to kindly threadbare discuss the possibilities. We are not bound about the time factor of 15 minutes, but we would like to have a thorough discussion of the subject of nuclear deterrence as it evolved during the Cold War and as it changed from the post-Cold War. Our primary concern is the post-Cold War. So even if less time is given to the Cold War evolution, I think we all understand what is the Cold War evolution of deterrence. But what is the current architecture of deterrence at the global level and at the regional level, particularly at the South Asian level? That is what we like to expect from both the experts. So I first request William Alberg to kindly express his views on the subject.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so very honored to be here, Dr. Chima, and thank you so much for Sherbano for helping organization of this. I'll note that I saw online that in 2018, a colleague of mine, Antoine Levesque, addressed this august body on nuclear deterrence. So I'm very grateful to do it today. Do we have the slides?
Do we have?
Yep.
Sure, Sir Mustafa. Please share the slides.
Excellent. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit about the evolution, but as Dr. Chima said, we'll try to focus on the current changes that are most important. Can we go to the next slide, please? So first, what's the definition of deterrence? Deterrence as a concept has existed as long as there has been human conflict. It is the idea of convincing any adversary that the cost of an attack is too high to justify the attack in the first place, and that would be a mistake. And there's the introduction of nuclear weapons has changed the concept of deterrence. Deterrence before the nuclear bomb was invented did not necessarily mean the death of your society or the end of life on Earth. But with the introduction of atomic warfare in 1945, deterrence changes in nature and becomes much more about the ability to threaten not just disproportionately high costs, but the cost of the total destruction of your enemy. The three classical types of deterrence that we see. So in the Cold War, they had to think of this new concept and try to develop a theoretical framework to understand it. A lot of that literature, folks like Herman Kahn, writing a book on thermonuclear war, which is one of the real sources for thought on deterrence. He defines three classic types of deterrence: the deterrence to prevent total war, the deterrence to prevent a localized or regionalized war, and then deterrence to prevent the bad guys from being able to coerce you into making decisions that you don't want to. At NATO, they see NATO's nuclear deterrence as preventing an attack on any ally or coercion against allies. At NATO, they also think of nuclear deterrence, well, they think of overall deterrence as combining nuclear, conventional, and missile defense. There was a lot of literature after September 11th about the ability to deter terrorism with nuclear weapons. But as you will know, in South Asia, that is deterring terrorism is a very tricky concept, and nuclear deterrence is not really suited to things like sabotage or terrorism. Next slide, please. So through time, there's so many different concepts that come in. You'll hear deterrence by denial or deterrence by punishment, extended deterrence versus direct deterrence. All these different concepts come in, but it still comes back to a very simple concept that nuclear weapons are one of the tools of a state for political ends. And those political ends can include either preventing the other side from attacking you, or there are other uses for nuclear weapons as well, to wipe out your enemy or to win a war. But deterrence, nuclear deterrence, again, about preventing conflict. Trying to describe it intellectually becomes difficult, because how do you measure deterrence? You can only really tell afterwards whether it worked. You know what I mean? It's hard to really judge or measure or define deterrence. So it's a concept that has consistently changed over time. And we've seen changes through the Cold War all the way to today. Next slide, please. In the Cold War, it was basically a quest for balance in numbers of forces. So it was a very primitive thinking about deterrence. When the US had the monopoly on the bomb between 1945 and 1949, the Soviet Union had vast conventional superiority. So it was about stopping them from attacking. Once the Soviets developed nuclear weapons, the United States and NATO agreed on a policy called massive retaliation. And this was the idea that any attack would escalate immediately to total nuclear war. And a lot of that was because of the impossible geography of the Cold War. You have to remember that Berlin is deep inside what was then East Germany. So West Berlin, which had US, UK, and French forces defending it, would be lost. There was no way to really defend it without being overwhelmed by the Soviet forces, which surrounded them on all sides. And so the idea was to tell the Soviets that war with NATO, an invasion of Berlin, would have resulted in war with the three nuclear weapon states that are in the NATO alliance, the US, the UK, and France. And in the Cold War, most nuclear weapons were very inaccurate. So they would tend to have the largest warhead possible in order to have an effect on target. Liquid-fueled missiles during the Cold War would often, what we call the circular error probability, the ability to hit a target 50% of the time, was very low. And so they would be able to come within 2 or 3 kilometers of the target 50% of the time, which means you needed a megaton or 2 megatons to be able to destroy what you were trying to hit. A lot of the short-range nuclear forces were right on the front line. So you had this use or lose dilemma, something that I'm sure anyone who studied South Asia deterrence will also be familiar with. The chances of those nuclear forces being overrun in a conventional attack means you have to use them. You have to make the decision whether to use them very quickly. Subkinetic warfare, so warfare below the level of conflict, then became the rule for the Cold War. Since the exchange of actual gunfire could result in World War III, both sides developed exquisite means to undermine each other without shooting. And both sides tried to defeat each other through things like sabotage, information warfare, etc., something, again, that we see today. In the middle of the Cold War, so around 1963, the United States, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, decided that you didn't need to rely on using all of your nuclear weapons at once. You could have what they called flexible response, so tailored nuclear missions. In other words, in some cases, you don't need to use all your nuclear weapons. You could use them just to stop a Soviet attack. And that was the doctrine to the end of the Cold War. But this period was very unstable. Deterrence, you could say, worked in terms of there was no major war, there was no general war between the US and the Soviet Union, but there were a series of deadly clashes all around the world. Warfare occurred between the sides, but through proxy battles mainly. And so you can't really say the deterrence kept the peace, but it at least prevented World War III from breaking out. Next slide, please. In the background there's a battle map, a Soviet battle map of the space, and you can see the red clouds are the Soviet nuclear strikes on Belgium, Netherlands, and West Germany that would occur on day one of a conflict. You can also see a little comparison from a formerly classified NATO slide trying to show the balance of forces between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And then again, as I mentioned before, you can see West Berlin and the impossibility of defending West Berlin in case of a Soviet attack. Next slide, please. So let's bring us up to today. What strategic environment do we live in? We live in a world where right now Russian forces are attacking a non-NATO ally, a former very close ally, and in fact, a former part of the Soviet Union, and their Slavic brothers, Ukrainians. There's open warfare right now between two very modern states with very modern militaries. One of those states is nuclear armed. The other state is, on its other side, has a nuclear alliance. We are also waiting to hear the results of the US nuclear posture review. Every new president of the United States must submit a review of their nuclear posture, and every president has done it for years and years and years. We're waiting for that process to finish. So the US and Russia have also engaged in strategic dialogue, and we'll see how that survives this war in Ukraine. But going back a couple of years, you can see how this environment continually shifts and complicates compared to the Cold War. We have the discovery last year of more than 300 new Chinese ICBM silos, which means that China has now abandoned its previous posture, which they declared as the minimal deterrence. They are now moving to a much more complicated triad of air-launched, sea-launched, and ground-launched nuclear weapons of all ranges. I would sincerely doubt that this posture is in any way supportive of no first use. The UK has reviewed their security policy. In 2020, French President Macron made a speech about deterrence, which is very important, pledging to defend Europe and NATO with nuclear weapons. And of course, we had actual clashes between two nuclear powers, China and India, a very, very interesting case where the two sides tried to keep escalation low by using as little conventional forces as possible in that attack, as I'd say less advanced conventional forces. 2019, the first air combat between two nuclear armed states in decades. Absolutely fascinating there. Also on how escalation was controlled in that particular situation. Pakistan in 2018 declared that it has full spectrum deterrence. 2017, President Xi of China declares that China will become a top tier military, which I believe the new silos are part of. And 2003, India's statement that nuclear retaliation will be massive and designed to inflict unacceptable damage. Next slide, please. The US, UK, and French deterrent all also pledged to support NATO. The UK only has nuclear missiles on a submarine. France has nuclear submarines and nuclear missiles launched from aircraft, but no ground force. And then the US has ground launched, air launched, and sea launched. Next slide, please. As do the Russians. They also have a very advanced triad. They are renewing every part of their nuclear arsenal, including short-range nuclear weapons, which we believe they have in great number, probably around 2,000, whereas the US only has around 200. They have a belligerent foreign policy, and they are willing to use nuclear threats in order to gain foreign policy objectives. As you may have heard last night, Russia threatened nuclear retaliation if the West gets involved in the Ukraine crisis. The first direct threat against NATO as a whole that I've heard Russia made with an implied nuclear threat in quite a long time. Next slide, please. But China, as I mentioned, going from no first use to a much more diverse and usable nuclear arsenal is a worrisome development. They are also a country that is seeking to rewrite the rule book. They're seeking to rewrite borders. They are, like Russia, trying to impose their own will. You can bet they're watching what happens with Ukraine very closely. They were unwilling to condemn Russia, probably because they're thinking of the same types of use of force against Taiwan. And this partnership between Russia and China also very worrisome and changing the dynamics. Next slide, please. I don't have to tell this audience, our next speaker will go more deeply into the nuclear dynamics in South Asia, but this is where the situation is quite different than the Cold War. Pakistan, just like West Germany, has this problem with geography. The capital city is within range of Indian conventional forces, which means deterrence becomes much more difficult. India has a very aggressive nuclear doctrine. India also facing China. So we have what we call hub and spoke entanglements in a way and on a scale that we didn't have in the Cold War. So India versus China could turn into China versus US, could turn into US versus Russia, Russia versus Japan, Japan versus South Korea versus North Korea, North Korea versus the United States. It's an enmeshed set of deterrence relationships. And now that China may be a near peer competitor to the United States, this makes deterrence in the 21st century incredibly complex. I don't even go into here North Korea and South Korea. Again, South Korea has a very similar problem to Pakistan in that Seoul is so close to the North Korean front lines that even with conventional forces, North Korea in the moments of starting a war would destroy Seoul and the capital city, killing millions. They have not yet relied on nuclear weapons. They rely on the defense of the extended deterrence promise provided by the United States. Then, of course, Israel. And now we see Iran potentially entering the nuclear realm very soon. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, contemporary nuclear deterrence is much more confusing. It's much more difficult. We have not seen an emergence of a consensus on nuclear deterrence policy as we saw in the Cold War. And this mixture, missile defenses, as Dr. Chima pointed out in his introduction, in the Cold War, it was decided that missile defenses were too destabilizing, and therefore both sides agreed to give that up and relied instead on mutually assured destruction to keep stability and to keep deterrence. With the US introduction of missile defense and removal of the ABM treaty, I believe that sparked a global nuclear race and encouraged, for instance, the Chinese to abandon their long-held policy of minimal nuclear deterrence. But now nuclear systems are also much, much, much more accurate. And you have conventional weapons, because they are so accurate, because now you can put a cruise missile, you can fire it 2,000 kilometers and have great certainty that you can hit a window, means that you need a much smaller bang in order to kill your target, which means your nuclear warheads, in order to have the same effects as Cold War nuclear weapons, can be much smaller. The more accurate you are, the less bang you need in order to kill your target. And so even conventional forces are now replacing nuclear forces for some nuclear missions. But there has been relative global stability, but of course, a series of conflicts have continued despite nuclear weapons presence and despite the fact that some nuclear weapon states have continued to pay the price for conventional war. Next slide, please. So 3 strategies are now kind of emerging as the thing that people talk about in terms of modern deterrence. The asymmetric escalation, the demonstration that you're willing to escalate more quickly than your enemy. This is primarily what we see from Russia. Russia being willing to escalate in a nuclear conflict very quickly in order to achieve their aims. Assured retaliation, this is more the United States policy. They want to make sure that we have a credible nuclear strike that can hit you if you hit us first. And the other thing that we have to worry about here is catalytic catalytic posture. And again, this goes back to the hub and spoke relationships among different countries, so that a conventional conflict between a nuclear weapon state and a non-nuclear weapon state might escalate to nuclear exchanges if one of those states, so say for instance, Armenia versus Azerbaijan, you might think two conventional states, no nuclear posture here. However, Armenia has a defense relationship with Russia, which is a nuclear state. Azerbaijan has a relationship with Turkey, who is in the NATO alliance, which is a nuclear alliance. So a conflict between two conventional states might end up involving nuclear powers. And this is catalytic. So you might end up seeing an intervention by a nuclear state in what is ostensibly a conventional conflict. The other thing that we have now that we didn't have in the Cold War is the rapid spread and increase in capabilities of what we call open source intelligence. That's OSINT. In the Cold War, it was national technical means. It was spycraft, it was spy satellites. Now commercial satellites and commercial analysis of imagery and commercial analysis of the movement of ships, the movement of planes, the use of cell phones, GPS trackers, gives civilians the ability to see things that the CIA could only have dreamed of being able to see during the Cold War. So now, in a crisis, you can't move nuclear forces without someone spotting it and putting it on Twitter, geolocating it. So this actually changes crisis stability. Now, when the nuclear powers can no longer signal to each other, but have to signal everything to the world, this has radical implications for stability and crisis. Next slide, please. And we have to worry about further proliferation, the spread of super accurate, super capable conventional missiles is worrisome for stability in crisis. Sub-launch ballistic missiles with conventional warheads are being built by South Korea. India with nuclear and conventional missiles, potentially from submarines as well. And then you have to worry about outer space, because outer space, we rely upon outer space for our command and control. So if in a crisis, the bad guys take out one of your satellites, they might hit a satellite that you're relying on for your nuclear command and control. You might believe that that therefore presages a nuclear attack and escalate immediately. So warfare in space is a whole new topic that we never really had to deal with on the scale that we have to deal with now. And technological advances that reduce the value of nuclear weapons. As I mentioned before, advanced sensors and the end of secrecy. The fact that in the future, quantum computing might help you to predict oceanographic movements to the point where submarines are no longer hidden. The seas become completely clear then, and then the whole idea of a survivable second strike that relies on nuclear weapons at sea is gone. So the future, so the current state of deterrence is we are in a new phase of learning how to cope with new technologies, new players, new actors. And in the future, it's only going to get more confusing. It's only going to get worse. Next slide, please. I think that's a fairly not optimistic, but accurate way to end my briefing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very illicit and a very comprehensive presentation on the nuclear deterrence in the post-Cold War era and in the Cold War era. We now request Brigadier Dr. Salek to talk about the South Asian manifestation of deterrence. So over to you, Brigadier Salek.
Thank you, Dr. Chima. I think my job has been made easy by Mr. William Albert, because I don't have to get into the theoretical aspects, and also the way he has comprehensively covered the international environment. I can now keep my focus on the South Asian region. First of all, I think some of the peculiarities of the South Asian situation have already been highlighted. The geography is one of them. And the disparity, a part of the geography is the disparity in the size of the two adversaries. India obviously has advantage in the size of territory, in terms of its resources, the size of population.
इतना उनकी जरा साइड enlarge कर दें ब्रिगेडियर सालेक की, उनकी जो स्क्रीन है उसको enlarge कर दें.
So the
Okay,
this disparity in the conventional forces, and then the disparity in the size of the two countries, the resource differences. So that is there. Then the contiguity of the borders of the two states, and a history of conflict over the last 70 years, the unresolved political disputes, and there's so many other things, the historical baggage of the partition, which is still fresh in the minds of the people on the both sides of the border. So all these things make the South Asian situation very peculiar, and because of the short distances involved, the flight time of the missiles and the delivery systems is very, very short. The problem related to these is the technological deficiencies. Despite the fact that over the last 2 decades or so, India and Pakistan have come a long way in operationalizing their nuclear capabilities and developing their command and control structures, as well as the delivery systems. But still, they lack in the real-time target acquisition and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. So although we have heard the talk of preemptive strikes by some very responsible Indians like Shiv Shankar Menon, a former NSA, in which capacity he was heading the executive committee of the Indian Nuclear Command Authority, he hinted at India's policy changing towards a preemptive strike policy. But the thing which is lacking at the moment is the lack of real-time target acquisition and ISR capabilities. Although the development of technologies to deliver those weapons accurately and the suitable delivery systems like MIRVs, those are being developed. And a stage then comes that instead of policy driving the technology start driving the policy, because it all depends on the tools you have, and you can only produce certain results with the tools for which they are suitable. For instance, you cannot do an electrician's job with a carpenter's tools. So if you have MIRVs and all those kind of things, so they can do certain kind of purpose, they may not be good for the declared credible minimum deterrence postures of the two countries, which are essentially retaliatory counter-value strategies. However, the technological developments which are taking place on both sides, they will lead them to change their strategies, although there is evidence of changes on ground, while there has been no change in the declaratory postures of the two countries. After the neutralization in 1998, both countries declared credible minimum deterrence postures. Now, minimum deterrence is already a very vague and hazy concept. It cannot be very precisely defined. The size of the forces remains dynamic, and once you added the prefix credible, that meant that the two countries were not satisfied with a minimal size of force, so they wanted something more than minimum. That is why they added this word credible. And then there were statements on both sides which stated that the credible minimum deterrence does not mean that we have static numbers. This is a dynamic concept subject to change with the changing environment, security environment, as well as the developments in technology. So that is what we have seen, that over the years, if you go by the estimates by most of the international data sources like CIPRI and Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, Federation of American Scientists, IPFM, etc., the general estimates are the forces, size of the forces of India and Pakistan are somewhere between 150 and 160, and some estimates talk of 155 and 165. So that is the case. So that means it is not minimal deterrence, it is little more than minimum. So that thing has to be there. India also declared no first use, but we have seen that over the years that no first use policy has been watered down. We have seen statements by the former Indian Defense Minister, Mr. Manohar Parrikar, and we've also seen statements by the current Defense Minister, Mr. Rajnath Singh, and certain other statements which indicate that the no first use policy may not be valid in any future contingency. There have been hints towards that. On the Pakistani side, although the declaratory level policy remains the credible minimum deterrence, but in that Pakistan introduced another complication by talking about the full spectrum deterrence. Now that concept, because it is not a familiar term in the nuclear jargon, although it is talked about in the conventional context, people have some confusion and doubts about what does it really mean. But what explanation which has come from Pakistani as responsible policymakers suggests that Pakistan wants to deter the whole spectrum of conflict from subconventional to conventional to nuclear. The reason is that there is a very substantial disparity between conventional forces of India and Pakistan's nuclear deterrence is aimed at not only deterring aggression by the Indians at the nuclear level, but also to deter the conventional level aggression. And that is why Pakistan's nuclear doctrine and policy remains sensitive to any changes even in India's conventional doctrine. And we have seen the manifestation of that after the introduction of the Cold Start doctrine by the Indians. Pakistan responded by introducing the short-range battlefield weapons, the Nasser weapon systems. Because the change in India's conventional strategy forced that change upon Pakistan. So that is the kind of relationship. Now, this is the dyadic relationship between India and Pakistan. But that has been further complicated, particularly in the last couple of years with the growing tensions between China and India and ongoing conflict in the Ladakh area. It's a triangular relationship. It's not a dyadic relationship, which makes things quite simple. But in this case, it is complicated. And then this new concept of security trilemma, which means that it's not one-on-one between the two adversaries, but there are other players also affecting this security situation. For instance, one, I have identified China, India, and Pakistan, the three actors in this region. But then it doesn't end there. There are branches, further branches to this, because China has then this competition with the United States, and anything the United States does, China reacts to that. And whatever China does, then that is responded to by India. And what India does then impacts directly on Pakistan's security situation, and Pakistan is then bound to react. So this kind of chain of events makes things far more complicated in South Asia as compared to the Cold War situation. On the development side, India has already deployed a triad of forces, and they have introduced the nuclear aspect in the maritime domain by deploying the nuclear-powered submarines carrying submarine launched ballistic missiles. So which has added a new dimension, not only in terms of the threat assessment, but also in terms of the nature of the deterrence in South Asia, because what we knew before this was that it was a rather relaxed and what we call the recessed deterrence situation in India and Pakistan, with both countries professing to have positive centralized control of their nuclear forces and keeping their nuclear weapons and delivery systems separately, unmated. So there was a time buffer involved in before the nuclear forces could be made ready to be launched. So that took care of accidental launch or unauthorized launches. But now what we see is that with the introduction of the maritime leg of the triad, this positive control by the centralized authority would no more be possible because of technical reasons due to the difficulties in communicating with the submarine. So there is a degree of pre-delegation already involved whenever you deploy weapons on the submarines, and then the captain and the XO of the submarine, they have a lot of freedom of action, and if they join hands, they can do a lot of things without getting the authority from the centralized authorities. The second thing is that because of lack of any geographical distance between the delivery systems and warheads in a submarine, that research posture is also gone. So you now have ready to launch forces, at least in one leg of the triad. How it is going to impact the other legs of triad, it is obvious that you cannot have one leg of the triad in a ready operational state while the others are not. So this will impact the land and the air legs of the triad also, and also lead them to have a higher level of readiness. So this research posture I can see is going away gradually. Also, there are certain other pointers to this. For instance, India has introduced the canistrized carriers for certain long-range missiles, which means that again, the warheads and the delivery systems are weighted and they are ready to fire at short notice. So all these things then are leading towards some kind of a situation where if there is a crisis in stability or there is a serious crisis based on faulty intelligence, misinterpretation of intelligence information, and misinterpretation of information, and the intentions of the other side, one or the other side can prematurely and mistakenly carry out a nuclear launch. And that's a very serious and dangerous situation, particularly in the backdrop of acute deficiency of trust between the two antagonists in South Asia. And also, there is no overarching strategic restraint regime or crisis management structure, which means that there will always be difficulty in receiving the signals from each other, which again is a situation peculiar to South Asia, where in a crisis situation, people who are totally unconcerned with nuclear operations or nuclear policy, they are the loudest in making statements, making nuclear threats. For instance, the Minister for Railways and Minister for Religious Affairs in Pakistan and certain ministers on the Indian side, they give statements without realizing the consequences. But unfortunately, during the Pulwama crisis, we saw that the Indian Prime Minister, who is the ultimate authority to launch nuclear weapons, himself made some very irresponsible statements. In one of the statements, he said that we are not keeping our nuclear weapons to be used on Diwali, which is a Hindu religious festival where they use fireworks. And on another time, we talked about the mother of all bombs and all those kind of things. And they even threatened the use of missiles, which is again very difficult. As I said, the flight times are very short, and there is no technology available at the moment which can give you the kind of warhead the incoming missile is carrying. So working on the worst case scenario, the recipient of such a strike would believe that it is carrying nuclear warheads, and if it is working on launch under attack kind of a posture, it might launch its weapons before waiting for the enemy's missile to land on its territory. So this leads to a very fluid and uncertain situation. Then we know that India has been pursuing a ballistic missile defense program for many years. And if you go by the claims of the Defense Research and Development Organization in India, DRDO, which is responsible for this program, they claim that the success rate of their missile intercepts is more than 90%. Whereas, as we know, after spending multi-billions of dollars and over 6 decades of effort, the United States Missile Defense Authority does not claim success rates of more than between 40 to 60% of the tests intercept they carry out in very controlled environments. But the problem with this kind of situation is that it gives you false sense of security. If you start believing in your own claims and you have the ballistic missile defense system, there is a false sense of security and it erodes the credibility of deterrence of the other side. And you start believing that if we go first, our missile defense systems will be capable of blunting the retaliatory strike of the other side. It also leads to the temptation for a first strike because you know the limitations of your missile defense systems and you would like to destroy as many adversary systems on ground before they're launched against you so that you feel confident that your missile defenses will take care of the residual strike which will come back at you. So all these things and the technological developments and the changes and the changes in the thinking and the doctrinal aspects, they are leading in very dangerous directions. And unless there are some measures put into place for crisis management and for bringing in some restraint measures, the situation will remain very dangerous. In fact, I would say that despite the fact that the ABM treaty, which was one of the pillars, as mentioned by Dr. Zafar Iqbal Chima, of the Cold War stability, although it has gone, but there is a need to emulate that and have a South Asian version of the ABM treaty to bring things under control here. Similarly, there's the new threats which are emerging in the form of cyber threat. So, like we have an agreement not to attack each other's nuclear facilities, maybe whenever the negotiations resume between India and Pakistan, we might have to negotiate non-attack, non-cyber attack on each other's nuclear facilities and non-cyber attack on each other's command and control facilities, because these things can have very, very serious implications. Similarly, then the advent of the modern conventional technologies like hypersonic weapon system, the AI-enabled system, the growing involvement of drones in the modern battlefield. These are all very dangerous developments, particularly because they can cause what has been termed as the entanglement of conventional and nuclear weapon systems. Because these weapons are very accurate and very fast, and they can also create the temptation to go for a preemptive strike against nuclear forces with these conventional systems. And that can create very dangerous situations. So all these things have to be kept in mind. And at the moment, given the situation where the international security environment is in flux, I don't see a light at the end of the tunnel and no silver lining is visible at the moment, but we have to think seriously about these things. Particularly the international environment is also not conducive for bringing in some restraint and responsibility in South Asia. If you look at, it was mentioned that China is increasing the size of its nuclear arsenal. Britain, which had planned to go down to 180 warheads by 2025, have now decided to go to 280 weapons. They have also, whereas they have withdrawn from East of Suez in 1960s, they have now come back into the Asia Pacific through the AUKUS agreement, which has recently been signed. The sharing of very dangerous technologies, nuclear technologies, with very serious proliferation implications to non-nuclear weapon states like Australia, and then the Quad and other alignments which are coming up. So these are all very negative developments. Unfortunately, the Russians are modernizing their nuclear weapons. The Americans have introduced low-yield warheads, which appear to be, or which might appear to be the decision makers to be more usable. And particularly once these kind of warheads are launched by Trident missile carriers, it can cause a lot of confusion because the other side may take it as normal Trident missile carrying the megaton throw weight. So all these things have to be discussed at some forum to bring it under some kind of, I would say, check and balance before things really get out of control. So I end my remarks here, and I will look forward to any questions which may be asked during the question answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Brigadier Salak, for a very comprehensive presentation on the South Asian manifestation of the evolution of nuclear deterrence. May I, before Sherbano, you begin, may I ask a question from Mr. Alberg about the installation of the S-400 Soviet-made ballistic missile system in India and how impact it would have it on the Pakistani deterrent capability?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. The Brigadier Salik had mentioned the need for some kind of agreement on missile defenses, but the problem is very, very capable air defenses become also very capable missile defenses. So an S-400 integrated into Indian air defense and detection network could start to threaten certain Pakistani missile capabilities. It depends on how many of them they buy. It depends how integrated they are into their air defenses. Is it just for a couple of key points, or is it more spread out? Because the more systems they buy, the more integrated that system is, the more Pakistan will have to look at different options in order to defeat Indian defenses. And this is that whole instability paradox that that causes arms races.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Brigadier Salak, Brigadier Dr. Salak, how would you see the intensity of the preemptive first strike by India on Pakistan?
As I mentioned earlier, the intention is there, but so far as I know from the open literature, the capability is lacking. And as we know that whatever size and nature of a preemptive strike, there is never a guarantee of 100% success of a preemptive strike. And in the nuclear environment, if you attempt a preemptive strike and it partially succeeds, then the consequences can be catastrophic for both sides. Because then whatever is left undamaged after this preemptive strike will immediately be shot at you. So that is a very, very serious thing. So talking of preemptive strike, and that too, if you go back to what Shiv Shankar Menon said, was that if we feel that a Pakistani nuclear strike is imminent, we might go for a preemptive strike. Now, judging that whether a nuclear strike is imminent or not, you can always go wrong in making that judgment. And then if it leads to a preventive strike or preemptive strike, then obviously the situation will be very, very dangerous. It will be the end game.
Thank you. Thank you. Over to Sherbano.
Thank you so much, sir. Our first question is for Mr. William Alberg. Although you have answered the question in the chat, we'd also like you to answer it live. The first question is from Mr. Samir Ali Khan. His question is, you mentioned Chinese non-condemnation of Russian actions by China. What is your take on the India being the only Quad member state not condemning Russian actions?
I can tell you it's very disappointing. I watched the UN Security Council live on Monday night, and I have to say the statement from Kenya was one of the most principled and strong statements of condemnation of Russia's actions that I've ever heard. During the Cold War, you would expect Kenya to either remain silent or, as a member of the NAM, condemn both sides or something like this, but there was absolutely no equivocation whatsoever. You would hope that India would, at the very least, right now be able to say that Russia has violated the UN Charter and its obligations as a UN member of the Security Council, but we're not hearing that. So that's a huge disappointment. And I think it shows the limits of the Quad as a format. If India is only looking at the Quad in terms of China, okay, well, fine. But if they're not willing to stand up to other crises, then it's a very limited format.
His follow-up question of Mr. Samir Ali Khan to you is, sir, how would the US or West deal with a similar limitation vis-a-vis countering China?
Right. I mean, if India in the Quad format's not willing to stand up to China, then there's no point in the Quad at all. At that point, you know, economic cooperation or something, fine, but no one will think of it as a security arrangement at all. The only value would be to develop an alliance to check Chinese ambitions around the world. Thank
you so much, sir. Our next question is for addressed to Dr. Naeem Saleh. The question is asked by Mr. Yusha Khan. She's a senior researcher at the SVI. What are the implications of alliances and agreements like Quad and AUKUS on the deterrent stability in the Indian Ocean?
First of all, so far we have not seen any such development, but what happens historically is that such alliances also give rise to counter alliances, and that then vitiates the security situation. But at the moment, if you look at the configuration of these are not limited to these 4 countries. They have been efforts to integrate other countries also. For instance, South Korea and Vietnam and other countries, bring them into the Quad, although then they may have to change the name of the alliance itself. It may become from Quad to Squad probably. But AUKUS certainly is very dangerous because the offer it is now making to Australia of transferring the nuclear powered submarine technology, and those submarines which are being run by the UK and US, they are run on highly enriched uranium, which is bomb grade level. Unlike the Russian, the Chinese, and the French submarines, which run on 30% enriched uranium. So if you are handing over large quantities of bomb grade uranium to a non-nuclear weapon state, so you are creating unnecessary problems. Particularly, it will be a very serious, I would say it will have a very serious impact on the non-proliferation regime. And if you look at the fine print of the NPT, it may not be the violation of NPT in letter, but it will be definitely a violation of NPT in spirit. Now, once you have given this kind of technology to a country like Australia, which also tends to think very high of itself, despite its limited military capabilities, they might get into some kind of brinkmanship and start challenging China. And they might then get into trouble and cause a war, which could have been avoided, because if they knew their limitation, they might not go beyond a line. But once they are given these submarines, they will try to become the policeman in that area. And that will impact the immediate neighbors of Australia, like Indonesia, Malaysia, other countries. They might also start feeling insecure. And then either they would seek some alliance or some support, or they might start to develop their own capabilities. It is also going to have an impact by setting a precedent, dangerous precedent, because once you accept this example, the other countries might also think that, okay, if the United States and Britain can hand over some nuclear powered submarine technology to one of their allies, why can't we do this? What will happen if China tomorrow decides to hand over this kind of technology to Pakistan? How would people react to that? So this can start a very serious chain of actions with very long-term implications. So it has to be seen from that perspective.
Thank you so much, sir. Next question is from Mr. Zafar Ali. He has commented, my appreciation to both the speakers. One basic element of deterrence is the will to use nuclear weapons to reinforce deterrence. Considering the culture and history of both India and Pakistan, how would you view the will part of Pakistan and India? He would be happy if you could precise examples are cited. And his question is addressed to both the speakers, sir.
Should I go?
Anybody can start first. You can start, Mr. Albert.
Oh, okay. So I would assess the credibility of nuclear use in war as very, very high on both sides. Pakistan, as I mentioned, well, as you all know, the dilemma faced if you're attacked by India is so incredibly high. The casualties in the first moment of a conflict would be so high. The threat to the survival of the state would be so high that I think Pakistan would have to contemplate nuclear use in order to stop an Indian attack. It's an existential question. And so I think that for the Indians, if the Indian government misunderstands that and thinks that Pakistan would not defend itself with all means possible, then I think that's a serious mistake. For the Indians, as the general pointed out, they have built robust nuclear capabilities in all domains. And so one has to take that seriously. They haven't invested in these capabilities to ignore them. And I think the way that their leadership speaks convinces me that they would use nuclear weapons if they felt that their strategic interests were at risk. I think for both sides, I say this very precisely, that both sides, to me, have very high levels of credibility when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons to protect their core national interests.
I think we have seen the political will and the credibility in the last crisis in 2019. There was some doubt after the 2016 claimed Indian so-called surgical strike because Pakistan refused to believe that there was such kind of strike, and it was interpreted that Pakistan was either incapable of or unwilling to respond to that. And that created a kind of doubt about Pakistan's will to respond to such a threat. And in 2019, Pakistan reestablished that credibility by acting very strongly to Indian provocation against Balakot. And that established the political will part of it. So as far as the technical capability is concerned, that there's no doubt about it. It is already there. The delivery system, the weapons, and command and control system, those are there. And the only thing which is intangible is the political will. And I think that has been manifested in the last crisis. And Indians will have to now think before getting into such kind of adventure. That is why I maintain that had Pakistan reacted to the 2016 Indian claims, even if there was no strike on ground, taking Indian claims on the face value and retaliated proportionately to that, that would have deterred India from doing such an action in 2019, because this is a game of chicken. And if you back off in one encounter, the other side believes that you will back off in the next encounter as well. So that I think there should be no doubt about it. And then if you look at the track record of the two countries, the history of conflict, violent conflict between the two, and particularly on the Indian side, the track record of the Modi government, the way they have used the heightening tensions on the LOC for the domestic political purposes, and the kind of attitude they have displayed, I don't think so anybody will have any doubt that a person like Modi will stay short of using nuclear weapons if it comes to that. So I don't see there is any credibility gap on both sides, and I agree with Mr. William Albert that the credibility of the two sides having will to go all the way is very high.
Thank you so much, sir. Our next question is posed by Ms. Amber Afreen. She's a research associate at the SVI. Her question is addressed to Mr. William Albert. As you have mentioned that Russia has threatened with nuclear attack in case of NATO's involvement, What is the future of US and NATO's nuclear deterrence in the wake of Russian attack on Ukraine?
That's a great question. And in contrast to the previous question, I would say that the credibility that NATO would use nuclear weapons in a conflict is relatively low. It would have to be something truly catastrophic for the 30 allies to agree to nuclear use. So I think this crisis, though, will strengthen that resolve and will push NATO to make their deterrent more credible, both on the nuclear side and on the conventional side. I think you'll see far more forward deployed troops by NATO, but we have to break some of the taboos that we built after the end of the Cold War. NATO and the United States and the UK and France all declared at the end of the Cold War that they would no longer join up conventional and nuclear exercises. The Russians, on the other hand, have no such restriction. So I think we have to see NATO do more integrated nuclear and conventional exercises, because we know that Russia is thinking that way. And if we can't even think about exercising what that is like, then how are we going to establish any credibility? I think you'll see higher readiness levels. I think you'll see discussions on whether having NATO's nuclear deterrent rely upon UK subs, the US triad, but then also US airdropped bombs forward deployed in Europe, whether that's a sufficient mix of deterrence capabilities. I think the French deterrent is a very good model. I think air-launched cruise missiles with nuclear weapons might be a more credible use scenario than the idea of an F-16 trying to penetrate Russian air defenses and drop a bomb. That seems not tremendously credible. So we'll see, but I think you're going to see a strengthening in political resolve. You're going to see a strengthening in conventional force posture. I think you're going to see a strengthening in rhetoric. I hope you're going to see real demonstrations of credibility in terms of exercises and increased ability and will to use that in order to defend the alliance against Russian aggression, because Russia has shown the wolf's teeth, as they say today, and we better prepare ourselves.
If I may add something to this, I think the introduction by the United States of low-yield weapons, which could be launched from submarines, was a kind of a solution to overcome the reluctance of the allies and the complicated nuclear use decision-making in the alliance setup. Now, because if these weapons are deployed at sea, they are not deployed on the European soil, then the Americans don't have to go through that tedious process of getting the consent of the allies, and they could still fire those weapons on the battlefield or any pinpoint target on the Russian territory or in Europe, anywhere, while still remaining at sea and with no obligation to ask the country concerned.
That's a brilliant insight. And often people think of the sub-launched nuclear cruise missile option. It is often thought of as assurance to Japan and South Korea, but you're absolutely correct. This provides the United States with another option in terms of supporting the NATO alliance without having to go through, as you point out, a difficult discussion, even in terms of new basing options or missile options like we saw in the 80s Euro missile crisis. So I can't help but agree fully with your insight.
Thank you so much, sir. So we have one last question. It's by Mr. Zafar Iqbal. He's a senior researcher at the SVI. The question is for Dr. Naeem Saleh. How do you see the future strategic stability in South Asia, keeping in view India's growing military buildup?
Strategic stability is a very dicey concept. There's so many aspects to this, and strategic stability can be disturbed in many ways. One is the kind of technologies which are being developed. The other is the problems, the outstanding problems between India and Pakistan, unresolved political disputes. Then is the geography itself, because the problem is that Indians have always been talking about a space for a limited conventional war below the nuclear threshold. Although they have not attempted it, but even the kind of surgical strike, this is a sub-conventional type of war, not even conventional level war. There are so many questions associated with this. For instance, what if the Indian strike had actually killed over 300 madrasa students as they had initially claimed. Where would that have led in terms of Pakistani response? Because then Pakistan would not throw its ordnance on empty spaces, but it would hit actual targets. And interestingly, at that moment in time, the brigade headquarters, which was attacked by Pakistani Air Force, there was the commander of India's Northern Army, as well as the corps commander who were present there. And had they been killed, or one of them been killed, or there been casualties there, what would have happened? Then what if the Indian stand-off weapon had accidentally, without even knowing, hit a sensitive location in Pakistan, maybe a nuclear storage site or a site where the nuclear delivery systems are stored inadvertently. What would have been the Pakistani reaction to that? And then you can go on, and then you can have, what if the Indian submarine, which had intruded into Pakistani waters, had it been destroyed by the Pakistani Navy rather than giving it warning and letting it go? What would have been the Indian response to that? So there's so many things related to this which can go wrong. And that is why even if both sides do not really want it, because of this recurring crisis between India and Pakistan, the danger of inadvertent escalation would always be there. And particularly in case of Pakistan, where the space is constricted and there is not much space between the conventional and the strategic targets. And inadvertently, during a conventional operation, if Indians hit at some strategic target, then the consequences can be very dangerous. And that makes the stability very tenuous in South Asia.
Thank you so much, sir. That's all from my side. Thank you to both the speakers for their invaluable remarks. Now over to Dr. Chima for his closing remarks.
I'm very profoundly thankful to Mr. Elberg and Dr. Salek for making tremendous contribution in the discussion today. And I'm also grateful to the participants who have listened to these two talks, very illuminated talks. And I'm also thankful to the Strategic VN Institute's management who have arranged today's webinar. And it's good luck. And thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Allah Hafiz.